She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. She just opened a leather coin purse, the kind that snaps shut with a little metal click, counted out $10 bills one by one on the gas station counter, and said, quietly, like she was saying grace, "This should cover it." The biker standing behind her hadn't said a word. He hadn't asked for anything. He was just standing there, helmet under one arm, card in hand, watching the little screen on the pump reader flash the same two words it had been flashing for the last 40 seconds. Declined, declined, declined. She had turned around because she heard it, that quiet mechanical rejection. She'd heard it before, in her own life, in other forms, in other years. And something in her, something that had nothing to do with logic or money, just moved. That was a Tuesday, in a small town in rural Tennessee. The gas station was called Ray's. There was a handwritten sign in the window advertising sweet tea for $1.25. The parking lot had a crack running through it shaped like a river. The biker's name was Denny Crane. He was 53 years old. He had exactly $0 in his bank account, and a motorcycle that was almost out of fuel, and a sister 240 miles away who had called him 3 days earlier and said, "Denny, I think this might be the last time." He had been on the road since 4 in the morning. He had not eaten. He didn't look like someone you'd feel sorry for. 6'1", boots worn to the leather, arms that told a story even when he didn't. The kind of man who looks like he was built for hard weather, the kind of man people cross the street to avoid. Not because he ever gave them a reason, just because of the shape of things, the jacket, the beard, the bike, the way he takes up space without apologizing for it. But the screen kept saying declined, and the old woman had turned around. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She was 78 years old. She lived 11 minutes away on a property her late husband Earl had bought in 1962 for $8,000 and a handshake. She drove a 1994 Buick that Earl had kept running until the year he died, and then she kept running after him, because what else do you do with something a person loved? She came to Ray's every Tuesday morning. She got a small coffee, black, and a newspaper because she still believed in newspapers. She kept the crossword for the afternoon. She had $87 to her name that morning. $87, until her Social Security check came in on the 15th. That was 11 days away. She put 10 of those dollars on the counter. The kid at the register, maybe 19, maybe 20, earbuds in, eyes half open, looked at the money, looked at Denny, looked at Clara, and said, "Pump 2?" "Pump 2," Clara said. And she picked up her coffee and her newspaper and she walked out. Denny stood there for a second, just a second, long enough to feel something move through him that he didn't have a name for. Then he walked out after her. She was already at her car, door open, one leg in. "Ma'am." She turned. "You didn't have to do that." She looked at him the way grandmothers look at you when you've said something technically true but entirely beside the point. "You've got somewhere to be. So do I. Drive safe." She got in the car. The Buick started on the first try, which it didn't always, and she pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. Denny stood there in the Tennessee morning air. His hands were still. His face wasn't. He walked back to his bike, took the nozzle, and filled the tank. He made it to his sister's house by noon. He sat with her for 4 days. She made it to the following Monday. He was holding her hand. Now, here's the thing about Denny Crane that you have to understand. He was not a man who talked about what he felt, not because he didn't feel things, because he felt everything, always had, and somewhere along the way, he'd learned that the world didn't always know what to do with that. So he kept most of it under the jacket, under the miles, under the engine noise. He had been riding since he was 17, bought his first bike from a guy in a junkyard for $350 and a promise to stop dating his daughter, which Denny had not technically kept, but had tried to honor in spirit. He'd been part of 3 different clubs over the years, none of which had ended cleanly, all of which had taught him something. He'd worked construction for 20 years, done mechanic work, done some things he didn't talk to people he'd just met. He'd been married once, for 7 years, and they were good years and hard years, and then they were over years. He wasn't a complicated man, he just had a complicated life, which is a different thing. The biker community he'd ended up with, the one that actually stuck, was called the Iron Compass. 38 members spread across 4 counties in Middle Tennessee, average age somewhere north of 40. Weekend rides, charity runs, the occasional poker tournament that always got more serious than anyone intended. They had a group chat that was mostly memes and road conditions, but sometimes in the late hours became something else, something closer to real. Denny wasn't the kind of man who posted a lot in that group chat. He came home from his sister's on Friday. He sat in his kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet in the specific way houses get when you've just come back from watching something end. He made coffee. He drank half of it, and then he opened his phone and he typed, slowly because he was not a fast typist, the whole story. The gas station, Clara, the $10, his sister, the 4 days. He typed, "I don't know if I'd have made it there without her." He put his phone face down on the table. He didn't look at it again until morning. There were 62 unread messages waiting for him. He read them in order, and partway through he had to put the phone down again for a different reason. The first message was from a guy called Big Pete, who was 260 pounds of loud laughter and genuinely terrible jokes, and had once ridden 600 miles in a rainstorm just to make it to a funeral of a man he'd only met twice. Big Pete had written, "Brother, tell me where she lives." Denny didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what Big Pete meant exactly, what he was proposing, how serious it was. It was 6 in the morning. He thought maybe it would settle into something smaller by the time people woke up properly. It did not settle into something smaller. By 9 that morning, the Iron Compass group chat had expanded. Someone had shared Denny's message, with his permission, they'd asked, to a wider network. 2 other clubs in the region, the Veterans Road Brotherhood out of Clarksville, which ran about 40 members, the Smoky Mountain Riders, a family-oriented club out of Knoxville with connections to about a dozen other groups through years of charity events and shared causes. By 3 in the afternoon, someone had confirmed Clara's address. Not in a threatening way, not in the way that sounds. Her neighbor was the sister of a guy whose brother-in-law was in the Veterans Road Brotherhood. It was a small state. People knew people. The neighbor had said, yes, that was Clara Whitfield. She was a widow. She was good people. She came to raise every Tuesday. "Tell me something," Big Pete posted in the thread. "What does she need?" Someone else replied, "What doesn't she?" On the following Tuesday morning, Clara Whitfield woke up at 6:45 as she always did. She made herself a single piece of buttered toast and black coffee and sat at the kitchen table and read what she'd started of the crossword the day before. She finished 3 clues. The 4th one stumped her. It always stumped her. She suspected the people who wrote crosswords enjoyed making her feel this way. She got dressed. Same routine, same coat from the closet by the front door, Earl's key holder on the wall, her keys on the second hook, same as always. She got in the Buick. She pulled out of her driveway at 7:52. She noticed nothing unusual on the roads. Small town Tuesday morning in October, leaves already turning, the air having that particular quality it gets when it's cold enough to see your breath, but not cold enough to complain about. A few pickups, a school bus, a delivery truck backing into the hardware store on Main. She parked at Ray's. She got out of the car, and she stopped. Because the parking lot, the lot with the crack shaped like a river, with maybe 8 or 9 spaces that were usually half empty at this hour, was full. Not full the way a shopping center parking lot is full. Full in a way she had never seen a parking lot full. Motorcycles, row after row after row of motorcycles, lined up along the edges of the lot, parked along the curb, continuing down the road on both sides as far as she could see. And standing beside them, or leaning against them, or sitting on them, men and women in jackets, in helmets tucked under arms, in leather and denim and flannel, talking in low voices, holding paper coffee cups, watching the road. She stood next to the Buick, and she looked at them. She counted later to the best of her ability, and she lost count somewhere after 130. The final number, as best anyone could piece it together afterward, was 207. 207 motorcycles, coming from 3 states. Some had ridden through the night. And then from somewhere near the center of the lot, a large man in a black jacket started walking toward her. Not fast, not slow, with the specific walk of someone who has something to say and has decided to say it. She recognized something in his eyes before he even got close enough to speak. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "my name is Denny Crane. We met last week." She looked at him for a long moment. "I remember you," she said. "You probably have some questions." She turned and looked at the parking lot again, at the rows of bikes stretching down the street, at the faces watching her quietly. "I have one question," she said. "Yes, ma'am?" "Did everyone get here safe?" Denny stood very still. "Yes, ma'am. Everyone got here safe." She nodded, as if this was the important thing, which to her it was. "Then I suppose we should get some coffee," she said. What happened over the next 3 hours was not what anyone had planned precisely, because no one had been precise in the planning. What had been agreed upon, loosely, was to show up, to bring things, to let Clara Whitfield know that her $10 had not disappeared into nothing. They had taken up a collection in the group chats. What started as an impulse among 38 members of the Iron Compass had spread through networks of connection, the way things spread in communities that had learned to move fast when someone needed something. The number that had accumulated by Sunday night was $6,240. They'd pooled it into a card, one of those basic ones they sell at the gas station register, which felt right somehow, felt like the kind of poetry that doesn't announce itself. But the money was almost beside the point, almost. What they brought alongside it, firewood, stacked and split, enough for a full winter, loaded in the beds of 3 trucks that had accompanied the riders. 2 of the women in the Veterans Road Brotherhood were volunteer nurses, and they arranged through a doctor who rode with the Smoky Mountain Riders a free medical checkup that Clara had been putting off because of the copay. A younger guy named Marco, who did landscaping between road trips, brought a crew of 4, and they went around to the back of Clara's property and quietly, without being asked, started winterizing the garden beds and patching the fence section that was listing badly toward the creek. The Buick, which Clara mentioned to exactly 1 person who mentioned it to 3 others who were mechanics, was brought around to the edge of the lot where it was inspected and its brake pads replaced and its belts checked and its oil changed by people who had nowhere else they needed to be. Clara sat inside Ray's at a corner table, and people came to her, 1 or 2 at a time, and talked about her, about Earl, about the crossword, about what road she used to take into town before they redid the highway. She was not overwhelmed, because she was not a woman who got overwhelmed easily, but something behind her eyes had changed by the second hour. Something that had been held in a particular position for a long time was resting just slightly, just enough. The kid at the register, the same 19 or 20-year-old with the earbuds, had stopped pretending to be indifferent by 8:15. By 9, he'd made more coffee than the machine was technically supposed to handle in a morning. By 10, he'd brought out his phone and taken 1 photograph, just 1, without thinking much about it, of Clara at the corner table with Denny sitting across from her, both of them with their hands around coffee cups, talking. He didn't post it right away. He held onto it for 2 days, not sure why. Here is the thing no one told you about Clara Whitfield before you needed to know it. She had spent 41 years as a school librarian, not a teacher technically, not a counselor, a librarian. The woman who sat at the desk at the back and helped children find the books that were going to matter to them, sometimes before the children themselves knew what they were looking for. The woman who remembered years later that you'd like to book about horses when you were 9, and who called your name when a new one came in, as if no time had passed. She had retired 14 years earlier, But the thing about a person who spends 41 years paying attention to other people is that they don't know how to stop. They notice things. They remember. They see what you need sometimes before you've said it. She had seen at a glance that Denny Crane was a man moving toward something with everything he had and not enough to get there. She had not thought about it. She had just acted. She would tell you it wasn't remarkable. She would tell you that Earl would have done the same, and that his mother would have done the same before him, and that this was just how people were supposed to move through the world. She would say this without any pride, which is how you know she meant it. But here is what she would also tell you if you asked her the right question at the right moment. Nobody had done anything like that for me in a long time. Not the 200 riders, not the firewood or the money or the Buick. She didn't mean any of that specifically. She meant someone seeing her, really seeing her, the way she'd spent her whole life seeing other people. She meant being on the receiving end of that, of someone looking at her situation and deciding, without hesitation, that it mattered. She was 78 years old in a house that got quiet at night, in the way houses get quiet when the person who used to fill them is no longer there. She paid her bills on time, mostly. She kept the crossword for the afternoon. She drove the Buick to Ray's every Tuesday. She had been doing all of this alone for 6 years. And on a Tuesday in October, 207 motorcycles showed up in the parking lot of a gas station to tell her that her $10 had not disappeared into nothing. The photograph the kid at the register took, Clara and Denny at the corner table, coffee cups, morning light coming through the window, went on the Iron Compass Club's Facebook page that Thursday. One of the members' wives had written a short caption, nothing dramatic, just the facts. What had happened at the pump, what Clara had done, and what happened the following week. By Friday evening, it had been shared 11,000 times. By Sunday, it had been shared over 300,000 times. By the following Wednesday, Denny's phone had rung so many times from numbers he didn't recognize that he'd had to turn it off, sit on his porch, and stare at the trees for a while, which was his preferred method of processing things he hadn't expected. News vans showed up in the small town in rural Tennessee. Clara, who had no particular interest in news vans, politely declined 3 interviews before accepting one from a local reporter named Brianne, who rode a motorcycle herself and mentioned it in her introduction, which Clara felt was the correct credential. What Clara said in that interview was not what anyone expected her to say. They expected her to talk about kindness, about generosity, about the writers who had come back. They expected the story to be about what she'd given and what she'd received in return. She talked instead about Denny's face, the moment when he'd come outside after her in the parking lot, the moment when he'd said, "You didn't have to do that." She talked about the specific expression on a person's face when they haven't been seen in a long time and then suddenly are, like a room lighting up that had been dark for a while. "That's all I was doing," she said, turning on a light. Brianne, the reporter, did not cry on camera because she was a professional. She also didn't not cry exactly. The Iron Compass held their monthly meeting 3 weeks after the gathering at Ray's. 38 members around folding tables in the back room of a barbecue restaurant that let them use the space on the first Monday of every month. Denny sat in the corner, which is where he always sat. Big Pete, who was exactly as loud and exactly as genuinely kind as his reputation suggested, called the meeting to order by banging a coffee mug on the table, which was not technically a gavel but served the same function. They talked about the upcoming Thanksgiving toy drive. They talked about route planning for the winter. They talked about a member's son who just got home from overseas and needed some community around him, the kind of community that doesn't ask too many questions and just shows up. And then Big Pete said, "Before we close, Denny, anything you want to say?" The room got quiet the way rooms get quiet around men who don't speak much, because when they do speak, it means something. Denny looked at the table, then at the room.
I've been riding for 36 years, rode through things I shouldn't have gotten through alone, and somehow did. Rode away from things I probably should have stayed for. Rode towards things I'm still not sure I deserved. He stopped. I don't know how to say what these last 3 weeks have been. I don't have the words for it. What I know is that an old woman in a coin purse with snap buttons took $10 out of what I found out later was $87 and paid for a stranger's gas without asking what for. And I know that 36 years of riding motorcycles and everything I've seen and done and been part of, all of it, I don't think I've ever been in a more powerful room than the one I was in at that gas station. Just me and her and the sound of the pump filling up the tank. The folding table room was completely still. I think she thought she was just being kind, Denny said. But what she actually did was remind 207 people, and apparently a few million more based on my phone, what we're all supposed to be doing, all the time, without making a big deal out of it. He picked up his coffee. Anyway, the toy drive. Pete, you said you had a new contact for donations? Big Pete, who was not a man given to quiet, was very quiet for a moment. Yeah, I've got a new contact.
Clara started getting letters the week after the interview aired. At first, a trickle, 4 or 5 a day, addressed to the gas station because people didn't have her address, and Ray himself sorted them into a box and called her, somewhat bewildered, to tell her she had mail. Then more. The letters came from other states, from people her age and people half her age, and people younger than her grandchildren would be if she had any grandchildren, which she did not, but had long since made peace with. They came from bikers and from people who had never been on a motorcycle and would never be on one. They came from veterans and nurses and people who worked in warehouses and people who worked in offices, and one letter came from a woman in Alaska who said she'd seen the story on her sister's feed and had cried for the first time in 2 years and was writing to say thank you, specifically for the crying, because she hadn't known she still could. Clara read every one of them. She kept them in a box. She answered the ones with return addresses. Not all of them, but as many as she could, in her handwriting, which was the handwriting of someone who had spent 41 years writing book recommendation notes to children. Clear, warm, slightly formal, the kind that arrives and makes you feel like someone who matters. Some of the letters arrived at Ray's for months. The gas station became, in a minor way, a kind of landmark. People came through town specifically to see it. The kid at the register, whose name was Tyler, got asked about it so often that he eventually taped the photograph to the wall next to the register. Not the viral one, but a different one that Brianne the reporter had given him a print of, larger, taken from a slightly wider angle. Clara and Denny at the corner table, morning light, 2 coffee cups, 1 conversation. Tyler looked at it most mornings when he opened the register. He wasn't sure why. He thought maybe it was because something in the photograph looked like something he was looking for, though he wouldn't have been able to tell you exactly what. He started paying attention to the people in line. That was the winter he realized he wanted to be a nurse. The specific thread of thought that led from that photograph to that realization made a kind of sense to him that he couldn't fully explain to his mother when he told her, though she cried when he did, so maybe she understood it anyway. The following spring, the Iron Compass organized what they called a Clean Roads Ride, a half-day route through 4 counties during which they stopped at designated points and picked up roadside litter, which sounds less romantic than it is when you're doing it with 200 people on bikes in April sunshine, with the mountains in the distance and a cooler full of drinks at the turnaround point. Clara came. She didn't ride, but she came. Someone had arranged for her to ride in the lead support truck, driven by Marco the landscaper, who had fixed her fence in the fall, and who she had since decided was, as she put it, a good egg. She sat in the passenger seat of Marco's truck with the window down and watched the motorcycles ahead and behind and thought about Earl, which she did often on roads like this, because Earl had loved roads.
He hadn't been a motorcycle man, he was a 65-mile-an-hour with the windows down man, which she'd always thought was the car equivalent of the same philosophy, getting somewhere but also being somewhere while you got there. At the midpoint of the ride, when everyone stopped at a wide turnout with a view of the valley, someone produced a birthday cake, because it happened to be Clara's birthday, which she had not mentioned to anyone, but which Denny had discovered through the neighbor connection that came up the first time. It said, "Happy 79" in blue frosting. The candles were the trick kind that relight after you blow them out, which had not been approved by Clara in advance, and which she dealt with by laughing in a way that rearranged everyone's face. 200 people sang to her in a turnout on a Tennessee road with the valley spread out below them and the afternoon light hitting everything at the angle that makes things look like they're being seen for the first time. She stood up on the running board of Marco's truck, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted to see them all at once. She looked out at the crowd of them, the jackets and the boots and the faces, young and old and somewhere in between, all of them looking back at her. "Thank you," she said. She said it once. She didn't explain it. She didn't need to. Denny made it back to his sister's grave 3 times that first year. Once in November, once in February when the ground was still hard, once in May when things were blooming. He brought her flowers from a roadside stand each time. He didn't talk much. He wasn't sure he needed him to talk. He sat with her the way he'd always been able to sit with her, in the specific quiet of 2 people who grew up in the same house and knew each other before they knew themselves. He thought about Clara each time, about $10, about $87 minus $10, about the way a single decision by a single person in a single parking lot on a single Tuesday morning had become something so large he still couldn't see all of it from where he stood. He thought about the machine, the one at pump 2, the way it said declined and kept saying it, the way the world says that sometimes in 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different registers. Declined, not enough, try another card, sorry, the account. He thought about what it meant that a 78-year-old woman with $87 looked at that and decided it was not acceptable. Not with anger, not with performance, just with her hand in her coin purse and her feet moving and her voice saying quietly like she was saying grace, "This should cover it." He got on the bike after each visit and he rode home, and he let the road do what the road does, which is take everything that's too big for a room and spread it out across the miles until it becomes something you can carry. He was still carrying it.
Ray's gas station is still on that corner. The crack in the parking lot is still shaped like a river. The sweet tea is still $1.25, which, Ray will tell you, is the one price in America that has not changed in 11 years, and he intends to keep it that way as a matter of principle. The photograph is still on the wall by the register. Tyler laminated it eventually because the edges were getting soft from being handled, because people who come in specifically to see it always reach out and touch it, which Tyler noticed and which he decided to accommodate instead of prevent. Clara still comes on Tuesdays, still gets the coffee, still gets the paper, still keeps the crossword for the afternoon, and still gets stumped on the 4th clue, because the people who write crosswords, she maintains, are doing it on purpose. She and Denny talk on the phone on Sunday evenings, not always for long, sometimes about the ride coming up, sometimes about what she's reading, sometimes about Earl, sometimes about his sister. Sometimes he calls and they sit on the line in quiet for a while, which is something 2 people can only do when they trust each other completely, and which takes less time to build than you would think sometimes if the foundation is right. She told him once, on one of those Sunday calls, what she'd felt when she first heard the motorcycles. Not the 200 of them returning. Before that, in the days between, in the moment right after she'd put the $10 on the counter and walked out. I wasn't sure it would matter, she said. Denny was quiet. I mean, I hoped it would, but I wasn't sure. I almost put it back. But you didn't. But I didn't. Another quiet. "Why?" he said. She thought about it. He could hear her thinking. Then she said, "Because I could feel something was wrong, and I had something in my hand that might help. And what are you supposed to do in that situation? Just stand there?" Denny didn't say anything. "Earl used to say," Clara continued, "that the distance between doing something and not doing something is always smaller than it looks. He said most people spend their whole lives standing on one side of that distance, telling themselves it's bigger than it is." Denny sat with that. "He sounds like he was something," Denny said. "He was everything," Clara said. And the way she said it wasn't sad exactly, it was the way you talk about something true that you've stopped needing to argue with. They hung up and he went to bed, and he lay there for a long time looking at the ceiling, thinking about distances, about how thin the line was between making it to his sister and not making it, between the machine flashing "declined" and a woman opening a snap-button coin purse, between 200 riders showing up on a Tuesday and 200 riders staying home, about how most of the things that had mattered most in his life had come through doors he didn't know were doors until someone else opened them.